The second plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards the total elimination is called to order. Vamos a abordar en esta tarde.
This afternoon we will begin with procedural aspects of the conference, beginning with item 4 on the agenda, that is the adoption of rules of procedure. We will begin, first of all, with looking at the issue of participation. I'm now going to move into English.
The conference will now consider the participation of the Holy See and the State of Palestine in this conference. Member states will recall that there has been a great deal of discussion concerning the participation of the Holy See and the State of Palestine in the conference on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote. After having listened to member states, it would appear that there is an overwhelming desire that the Holy See and the State of Palestine participate in the conference on an equal basis, including with the right to vote. However, I would like to reiterate that the General Assembly Resolution 71-58 only encouraged member states to participate in the conference. The resolution does not specifically refer to the Holy See and to the State of Palestine participating on an equal basis with member states, and therefore, both states would normally participate as observer states. After taking into account the very strong views of member states and the fact that there is no time to revert to the General Assembly on this matter, I would like to propose the following procedural decision of the conference: that without setting a precedent, the Holy See and the State of Palestine participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote, in the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward the total elimination. If there are no comments on this proposal, may I take that the conference decide that without setting a precedent, the Holy See and the State of Palestine shall participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote, in the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward the total elimination. I have the request from the floor for the delegation of Mexico.
Many thanks, Madam Chair. This morning, my Vice Minister had the honor of congratulating you and offering you every support, the full support of my delegation. This is something that I personally now wish to reiterate to you. I don't want to refer to the substance of this decision. I simply wish to understand the procedure followed and the implications which it has regarding the rules of procedure which will guide the work of this conference. What are the links between this decision and any other decision which may be necessary to adopt regarding the rules of procedure which will guide the procedure followed by this conference? I just wanted a little bit more detail and clarity from you or from the Office of Legal Affairs, if necessary, through you on these matters. Thank you. I thank the delegation of Mexico. This decision is necessary to be able to proceed with the adoption of the rules of procedure and the amendments which have been tabled with a view to reflecting this desire. a desire that's been expressed by the room, that is to have the State of Palestine and the Holy See participating in this conference on an equal footing. This procedural decision which I'm proposing is necessary so that we are able to begin to broach the issue of the rules of procedure and their corresponding modifications and amendments more specifically. If there are no further comments, can I take it that the conference decided that without there being established a president, the State of Palestine and the Holy See are to be able to participate on an equal footing with member states, including with a right to vote, in the United Nations Conference for the negotiation of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. There are no further comments. It is so decided. Before we move to looking at the rules of procedure, allow me to invite the Holy See and the State of Palestine to take their seats in the conference.
Entramos al conocimiento.
We now move to the consideration and adoption of the rules of procedure. I now speak English.
I wish to draw your attention, the attention of the delegates, to the proposed provisional rules of procedure of the conference contained in document A/conf.229/2017/L.1 and to the revisions being circulated desk to desk in the conference room now to reflect the decision just taken by the conference. On this matter, I have undertaken informal consultations on these draft procedural rules, both in Geneva and in New York, and it is my understanding that the conference is prepared to proceed to their adoption with the revisions as circulated. I will give the delegations just a few minutes to make sure that the document has reached you. Voy a pasar a...
I'm now going to look at the reference to... Oh, I'm going to look at the changes proposed now.
I am going to refer to the revised version of the Rules of Procedure. In Rule 1, the following amendments have been introduced. The words member and of the United Nations are deleted. So the rule as a whole now reads: the delegation of each state participating in the conference shall consist of a head of delegation and such other representatives, alternate representatives, and advisors as may be required. A footnote is included after the word state, which explains the term state is understood as the member states of the United Nations and the Holy See, and the State of Palestine as the observer states of the United Nations in light of the procedural decision taken by the conference on March 2017 that the Holy See and the State of Palestine will participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote. End of the footnote. Subsequently, the term member states, where it appears throughout the rules, now reads states. The rules affected by this change include Rule 6, Rule 19, Rule 34, Rule 35, Rule 36, Rule 37, Rule 61, and Rule 63. Rule 56 is deleted, and the subsequent rules are renumbered accordingly. Those are the amendments that were introduced to the draft rules of procedure that we're now considering after the adoption of the procedural decision that we have recently taken. May I take it that the wish of the conference is to adopt the draft provisional rules of procedure as contained in document L.1 as orally revised? It is so decided. The Republic of Iran had requested for the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First, allow me to congratulate you, Madam President, for presiding over this important meeting, which is aimed at prohibiting nuclear weapons and the total elimination of these inhuman weapons. Indeed, presiding over this important conference is an honor. Secondly, allow me to be the first who congratulate the State of Palestine and the Holy See for having their position within the member states of the United Nations participating in this conference. The position that they deserve it. And I also congratulate you, Madam President, for the consultations you conducted on this issue and your ability to have the conference to adopt such an important decision today. And thirdly, Madam President, in regard to the rules of procedure, as it is well known for many delegations in the hall, we had some concerns, not about the whole rules of procedure, but only in regard to the issues related to the consensus. And despite some consultations that we had and also discussions we had with different delegations and with you, Madam President, unfortunately, we couldn't come to an agreement to go along with the decision. And that's why before you decide and adopt the rules of procedure, I pushed the button and asked for the floor to ask if there is a possibility only to defer the issue for the next day, then we can consult with our capitals. Taking into account that now it is in the midnight in the capital and we cannot actually consult with our colleagues back in Tehran, and that's why I'm proposing the deferral of the consideration of this issue only to tomorrow. Then it will provide us with an opportunity to consult with our capital and hopefully come up with satisfactory, let's say at least some instruction that we can go along with these rules of procedure, or at least to have clear instruction contrary to what we have it now. This is my request, and if the President can defer this issue only 24 hours, and we can consider it later on, taking into account that we are not necessarily forced to do that now, and the decision on Palestine has been taken, and we can continue till tomorrow. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la...
I thank the distinguished delegation of Iran for those comments. We have taken due note of those comments. The rules of procedure have been adopted by this conference. The conference wishes to move forward now with matters of substance. If you wish to make any amendments, you will have to use the rules proposed to do just that, but the rules of procedure as such have already been adopted. Thus, we now move forward with our consideration of procedural matters.
Ha solicitado la...
The delegation of New Zealand has asked for the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Here I am over here from New Zealand. Like my colleague from Iran, I did endeavour to signal to you that I had a question I wished to put before the rules of procedure were adopted. But unlike my colleague from Iran, I'm not wishing at all to defer adoption of those rules today. I just wanted clarification, please, Madam President, about the intention in deleting Rule 56, which appears in the version of the rules we've just been handed out today in red. I was concerned that the effect of the deletion of Rule 56 would not enable my colleagues from the South Pacific, the Cook Islands and Niue, states neither of which are members of the UN, it would not enable them to observe proceedings as we would have wished. I don't wish to delay adoption, and I understand it already has happened, of the rules of procedure, but I would just request clarification about why Rule 56 needs to be amended outside of its application to the Holy See and Palestine. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished delegate of New Zealand. In terms of the participation of the Cook Islands in Niue, if so is the desire by this conference, a separate decision can be taken to allow them to participate. The delegation of Iran has requested the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. As it happened to distinguished delegate of New Zealand, the same happened to our delegation that we requested for the floor before the adoption of the rules of procedure, or let's say before you gavelled. And now we have a procedural question. According to the rule of the business, if there is a request before adoption of a document, then a delegation requesting for the floor has the right to explain his position or to state his request or whatever he intends to say to the conference. We, as a delegate, requested before you gavel to have the floor. And this opportunity was not given to us. And now you are actually deciding that the rules of procedure of the conference was adopted while there was a request for the floor beforehand. And we want to have clarification from the legal section of the conference, and more importantly, the question is that this request for the floor was exactly directed at the issue at hand. I mean, the adoption of the rules of procedure. Then I would be very appreciative to hear the comments of the legal advisor of the conference on that. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la
I thank the distinguished delegation of Iran. I have had it confirmed to me by the legal advisor of the conference that the rules of procedure have been adopted. Thus, we have concluded indeed our consideration of point 4 of the agenda, adoption of the rules of procedure. Consideration of item 4 has now finished. The delegation of Iran has called for the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Although we need the references to the rules of procedure that based on what ground and based on what rule of the UNGA which applies to this conference, legal advisor decides that the rules of procedure was adopted while there was a clear request for the deferral of such a decision. But in any case, now I want to explain my position regarding to the rules of procedure, that we have problem with the way the issues related to the consensus is drafted here, which gives somehow the opportunity for its interpretation in some cases. What we wished to have rule of consensus to be applied to all decisions, and every effort should be made to reach consensus. And the decision that all the efforts is exhausted to be taken by the conference, not the officer presiding over the conference. We were proposing this idea, as it is the case in the rules of procedure, other important disarmament fora as the NPT Review Conference and Biological Weapons Review Conference. This is what we are dealing with. This is the rule of the game in the disarmament fora, and we didn't wish to see their reinterpretation of this rule. That's why we were asking for the deferral of the issue and to have an opportunity to see if we can come to a conclusion on that. And what, again, we were proposing was not our own language. We were proposing exactly the language of the NPT review conferences, that it applies to the review conferences of the NPT since 1975. And as all of us here are state parties to the NPT, then we hope that it would be agreeable to all of us. But in any case, we don't want to interrupt the process of the conference, and we don't want to prolong this debate. And although we are disappointed with what happened, but we respect the president of the conference, and we hope that it will not happen during the next meeting of the conference, and we would be able to adopt all procedural issues based on, substantive issues based on consensus, and at the end we will have a treaty which is agreeable to all of us. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iran. And now we move on to, we have taken note of your consideration, Mr. Delegate. With respect to agenda item 5, organization of work, The conference, at its organizational session on 16 February, took note of the indicative timetable for the meetings of the conference as contained in document A/conf.229/2017/3. The conference will now consider Agenda Item 6, entitled Election of Other Officers. I would like to inform the conference that with the adoption of its rules of procedure this afternoon, the conference has agreed to elect a president and 9 vice presidents. I have been informed of the following nominations for vice presidents as endorsed by the respective regional groups. I will mention them as of now. From the group of Asia-Pacific states, Iran. From the group of Western Europe and other states, Austria. May I take that the conference decides to elect the vice presidents nominated by the regional groups? I see no objection. It is so decided. On behalf of the members of the conference, I should like to take this opportunity to express my warmest congratulations to the vice presidents from Austria and from Iran in their election. And let the conference know that the remaining vice presidents will be elected upon receipt of their nominations from the regional groups. I would also like to appeal to those regional groups that have not yet done so to nominate their remaining vice presidents as soon as possible. The conference has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 6. The conference will now consider sub-item A of Agenda Item 7, entitled Appointment of Members of the Credentials Committee. I would like to draw the attention of the conference to the first sentence of Rule 4 of the Rules of Procedure, which states that a Credentials Committee of 5 members shall be appointed at the beginning of the conference. Following consultations, it is proposed that the Credentials Committee should consist of the following 5 member states: Azerbaijan, Malawi, Paraguay, Sri Lanka, and Sweden. May I take it that these states that I have just mentioned are hereby appointed members of the Credentials Committee? I see no objection. It is so decided. I would like to take this opportunity to remind delegations to submit their credentials as soon as possible for consideration by the Credentials Committee. The conference has thus concluded its consideration of sub-item A of Agenda Item 7. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the conference shall now continue to its high-level segment under sub-item A of Agenda Item 8. I would note that for the remainder of the high-level segment of the conference, statements will be delivered from the floor. Y ahora,
And now we will hear from the distinguished permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations. Many thanks, Madam President. Our congratulations to you on your election as the President of the conference. The delegation of Ecuador is proud to see a distinguished Latin American woman, taking up this lofty responsibility. As always, Latin America and the Caribbean wish to stand at the forefront of efforts to promote nuclear disarmament. We assure you that you will have the unwavering support of my delegation as you discharge your duties. Madam President, Ecuador aligns itself with the statement made this morning by the permanent representative of El Salvador on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. On Thursday, the 24th of January of 1946, a distinguished Ecuadorian diplomat, Ambassador Homero Viteri Lafronte, took the floor during the 17th meeting of the United Nations General Assembly during his first session. He did so as rapporteur of the first committee to submit for the consideration of the plenary a draft resolution entitled, and I quote, "The creation of a committee to deal with the problems caused by the discovery of atomic energy," end quote. Among the duties of this commission was the task of issuing recommendations to eliminate atomic weapons and all other weapons which would permit mass destruction. This resolution, the first in the history of the General Assembly of the United Nations, was unanimously adopted in 1946. Its unanimous adoption was an expression of the fact that since the very inception of the United Nations, the primary concern of member states would be the elimination of nuclear weapons. It was an Ecuadorian diplomat that had this honour of tabling this draft resolution, and his tabling this resolution marked the start of my country's continued desire to drive forward efforts towards nuclear disarmament and ensure the complete elimination of such weapons from the face of the earth. On the 29th of April 1963, the then President of the Republic of Ecuador, Carlos Julio Arosemena Monroy, signed, together with the Presidents of Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, a joint statement. This joint statement expressed the fact that these countries and their governments, and I quote, were ready to sign a multilateral Latin American agreement which would see countries commit to not manufacture, receive, stockpile or test nuclear weapons or devices allowing nuclear weapons to be launched, end quote. These 5 states had in 1962 already sponsored a draft resolution tabled before the General Assembly on the denuclearization of Latin America. This joint statement of the 5 presidents was the predecessor of the Treaty of Tlatelolco and of the Agency for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and the Caribbean, OPANAL. By happy coincidence, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this agency this year. I cannot fail to mention the fact that the first Secretary General of OPANAL was another distinguished Ecuadorian diplomat and was permanent representative for several years to the United Nations, Ambassador Leopoldo Benitez Vinueta. In 1975, this diplomat was elected President of the General Assembly. Madam President, for Ecuador, nuclear disarmament, the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons has been a priority from which we have not wavered for more than 7 decades. And now, the fact that this is a priority to us is reflected in our Constitution. Our Constitution prohibits the development, production, possession, sale, import, transport, stockpiling, and use of weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and nuclear weapons. Ecuador is firmly committed and a firm champion of the overriding need to ensure nuclear disarmament, and this conviction became more urgent during the conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons held in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna. These conferences prompted many of us to consider the need of convening a negotiation process as an important one. This negotiating process is now being initiated in such a format which allows the open participation of all member states, but which cannot be blocked by any single member states. These two principles are both equally important, and these are principles which have been championed by the delegation of Ecuador, particularly regarding debates on the rules of procedure that are to govern this conference. And we reaffirm our respectful appeal to ensure that all states, including nuclear weapon states and in broad partnership and their broader partners, are able to and participate unconditionally and on equal footing in these negotiations alongside or in the negotiations in which we look to ensure the common security of all of us and a future for humankind which is free of nuclear weapons. These are the only weapons of mass destruction which have not yet been prohibited by a universal instrument. We must, of course, bear in mind our overarching and ultimate goal, which is the attainment of general and complete disarmament. It is for this reason that for the delegation of Ecuador, today is a particularly important day because it is the first day of the United Nations Conference for the negotiation of a legally binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons and an instrument leading to their total elimination. This first day of this conference is the beginning of the necessary work to lay down the legal foundations which will underpin future efforts to ensure nuclear disarmament and the definitive elimination of these weapons of mass destruction. And in so doing, we will comply with our obligations as state parties to the NPT and obligations arising from Article 6, and we will strengthen this treaty with our work. In the coming days, Madam President, we will present concrete ideas regarding the content of this future treaty, including the content of its preambular section and of its institutional provisions. But we indicate from the outset that, in our opinion, the new instrument must be focused on achieving a general regime for the prohibition of the development, production, transfer, transit, possession, sale, import, transport, stockpiling, threat of use, and use of nuclear weapons. In addition, we also state, moreover, that it must contain clauses which prohibit the assistance, financing, or promotion of the perpetuation of prohibited activities. These provisions should be clear and precise in nature in order to ensure that they cannot be misinterpreted. At the same time, in its structure, the treaty must lay the foundations to ensure that through additional protocols, we are able, where necessary, to include fundamental elements such as verification and the future accession of nuclear weapon states. Madam President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, today, this is a historic moment. We must all be able to do the best we can and ultimately live up to the deepest desire expressed by all peoples of the earth, particularly following the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The desire expressed by all to ensure that we prohibit forever nuclear weapons and achieve their irreversible total elimination. Many thanks. I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Ecuador to the United Nations, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Peru to the United Nations. Madam President, thank you. First of all, allow me to congratulate you for your work at the helm of this crucial conference, and I wish through you to extend my greetings to the Secretariat and the Bureau. My delegation endorses the statement made by El Salvador on behalf of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC. Madam President, Peru is a country with a long tradition in the promotion of disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control. Moreover, it is party to international regimes in this sphere, and we attach the utmost priority to such regimes. This is one of the pillars of our foreign policy and a testament to our genuine desire to achieve general and complete disarmament. We are attending these negotiations at a time when more than half of the global population lives in countries which possess nuclear weapons or form part of nuclear partnerships. Despite the growing concern at a global level around the catastrophic consequences of the use of one nuclear weapon alone, there are still around 17,000 nuclear warheads in existence across the world. To date, no progress has been made to continue with the dismantling of nuclear arsenals in line with any treaty, bilateral or multilateral in nature, and neither are negotiations underway on this matter. On the contrary, nuclear weapon states have programs looking to modernize their nuclear arsenals, and these have been in place for a long time, and they are properly financed, and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence prevails in their security policies. For this reason, these negotiations are being undertaken at a time when the international stage is painting a murky picture, or presenting a murky picture, given the paralysis of nuclear disarmament machinery in various fora. And we're holding these negotiations at a time when for 2 decades no significant results have been achieved. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was the last outcome of the Conference on Disarmament, has not yet entered into force despite the concerted efforts made by several states. The conference has not been able to reach an agreement on a program of work in recent years, and the Disarmament Commission of the United Nations has not produced results since 1999. In sum, the credibility of the structural process of disarmament is now at stake. Madam President, for my country, the current situation is unacceptable. For this reason, we believe it is necessary to begin walking in a decisive fashion along the path towards granting or producing international legal guarantees which will strengthen the principle of collective security. Against this backdrop, we reaffirm the need to resolve the paralysis of disarmament machinery and move towards the overarching goal of general and complete disarmament under strict international control, and achieve the prohibition and total elimination of nuclear weapons. We reaffirm our intention to actively participate in the negotiations on a legally binding universal instrument which prohibits in a transparent, irreversible and verifiable way nuclear weapons within a multilaterally agreed timeframe, and which leads to their total elimination. Aware of and committed to this goal, Peru participated in the work of the open-ended working group, and moreover we sponsored the resolutions of the General Assembly, one entitled taking forward multilateral negotiations on nuclear disarmament, the humanitarian commitment to the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Another resolution was the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and another were the ethical imperatives of a world free of nuclear weapons. These were all resolutions adopted by the 70th session of the General Assembly. Moreover, Peru endorsed the humanitarian commitment, given the serious consequences that a detonation of nuclear weapons can have for humankind, the environment and food security. Madam President, what doesn't exist cannot cause damage. Quite simply, nuclear weapons should not exist. In this connection, my delegation expresses its deep concern regarding the threat represented to humankind by the existence of nuclear weapons, as well as their use, the threat of their use, as well as its concern regarding their humanitarian impact. For this reason, their use and threat of their use constitute a crime against humanity and a violation of international law, including international humanitarian law, as well as a violation of the United Nations Charter. For this reason, the only effective guarantee of their prohibition and total elimination in a transparent, verifiable and irreversible way and within a clearly defined time frame is the only step forward that we can take. Madam President, given the devastating humanitarian consequence of the use of nuclear weapons, we advocate the establishment of nuclear weapons-free zone. These nuclear weapons-free zones would largely contribute to the strengthening of nuclear disarmament and to non-proliferation regimes, and would constitute a significant step towards and contribution to peace processes. Moreover, the creation of such zones would stop terrorists or non-state actors from acquiring these type of weapons or from diverting them as well as their parts, and would prohibit their access to their production systems. And such access destabilizes peace and security at a regional and global level. Madam President, international legally binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons on the basis of their unacceptable consequences would mean that nuclear weapons were on an equal footing with other weapons of mass destruction. In other words, a future treaty would have the transformative potential to codify as illegal nuclear weapons. It would also be transformative insofar as it could stigmatize their possession and facilitate nuclear disarmament. The future binding agreement should be based on existing norms and strengthen existing legal instruments. For this reason, it should be based on the highest standards contained in regional treaties on nuclear weapons-free zones and based on other relevant agreements. In sum, Madam Chair, it is imperative that this binding agreement ensures that all aspects of possession, use, threat of use, or production for the use of nuclear weapons are categorically illegal with no exceptions made. Finally, I wish to conclude my statement by reaffirming the unstinting and robust commitment of Peru to disarmament. In this connection, we wish to renew our readiness to lend momentum to all necessary measures and to support those initiatives whose aim is to institute a legally binding obligation not to possess and to eliminate nuclear weapons as soon as possible. For this reason, we are committed to lending our most unwavering support to the work of this conference. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru to the United Nations, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Cuba to the United Nations. Thank you, Madam President. We are delighted to see you having assumed this lofty responsibility because we are aware of your skills and your diplomatic experience. My delegation endorses the statement made by El Salvador on behalf of CELAC and wishes to, of course, congratulate you, as I said, on your election as the president of this important United Nations conference. We also wish to congratulate the other members of the Bureau. You all have Cuba's full support and commitment. The international community took an important step forward towards nuclear disarmament when it adopted Resolution 71/258 of the General Assembly. This resolution, among other things, took the decision to convene this United Nations conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons and to lead to their total elimination. Nuclear weapons are a threat for humankind and its very survival. Their use or threat of use in any circumstances would constitute, pursuant to the advisory opinion of the ICJ, a violation of international law and a crime against humanity. However, nuclear weapons are the only weapons of mass destruction which have not yet been prohibited through a legally binding instrument. It is unacceptable to continue with the status quo when, since 1946, in the first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations and in several subsequent resolutions, calls have been made for the elimination of nuclear weapons and from national arsenals, and since 1978, in the first extraordinary session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament, nuclear disarmament was declared a priority along with the goal of ensuring the complete elimination of this type of weapons. Madam Chair, the ultimate overarching goal of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons must be the total elimination of these weapons. This is all the more relevant and crucial against the current backdrop, and in this context characterized by the refusal of nuclear weapon states to comply with the commitments made pursuant to Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the agreements achieved in review conferences of 1995, 2000 and 2010. There was the failure of the NPT review conference in 2015. They have attempted to legitimize the possession of nuclear weapons. They have built on their policy of nuclear disarmament, and they've continued to modernize and develop new types of nuclear weapons. Cuba believes that the adoption of a convention on prohibition is only one intermediary step, and we believe that these negotiations must lead to the adoption of a broad agreement which provides for and stipulates that there must be the elimination of nuclear weapons in an agreed-upon time frame and under strict international verification and control. This would be the only way of guaranteeing full, effective, irreversible, transparent, and non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament. A legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons alone would not lead to nuclear weapons, but it would codify in international law the illegitimate nature and the illegal status of nuclear weapons. It would help to establish norms and rules to facilitate the elimination of these weapons, and it would reinforce the regime of disarmament and non-proliferation which already exists, including the NPT. This instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons must be as clear and as comprehensive as possible and must lead to the elimination of these weapons. In this connection, it must include inter alia the following provisions: categorically prohibit the possession, production, development, testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, deployment, positioning, use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. It must prohibit any activity related to military preparation exercises or other exercises to ensure the use of nuclear weapons. It must prohibit research, design, and production activities to hone and modernize nuclear weapons. It must prohibit nuclear tests, including subcritical tests or tests using sophisticated digitized computer-based methods. It must prohibit the incentivizing of any activity related to nuclear weapons, including specifically the financing of these activities. It must prohibit the transit of nuclear weapons through airspace and through territorial waters of states party to the instrument, as well as the presence of these weapons in their ports and aerodromes of ships or foreign ships or planes which transport nuclear weapons. This instrument must also include specific provisions for nuclear weapon states. In addition to the previous provisions mentioned, the provisions could be as follows: that to destroy in a defined time frame nuclear arsenal that they have or which is located in a place under their jurisdiction, a provision stipulating the destruction of nuclear weapons that they have abandoned on the territory of other states, destroying or reconverting for the destruction of nuclear weapons, production facilities or facilities allowing the testing of these weapons, destroying or reconverting to non-nuclear purposes systems which allow the transport of nuclear weapons. It could provide for the prohibition of the production of fissile material for the production of nuclear weapons and other nuclear explosive devices, and the destruction of stockpiles. It could provide universal, unconditional, and legally binding guarantees that these states will not use nuclear weapons while they have them against states parties to the instrument. It could provide for the elimination from their military and security doctrines the role of nuclear weapons. It could provide for the withdrawal of all reserves and interpretive declarations made in relation to protocols to treaties which establish nuclear-free weapons, and it could provide for the contribution to the establishment of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East. In our view, the instrument must contain a whole set of rights and obligations for states parties, as well as verification measures to ensure compliance with and implementation and enforcement of its provisions. Moreover, this treaty should establish a mechanism responsible for applying the provisions and enforcing the provisions of these instruments, including those pertaining to verification and compliance. it should also enable or create a forum for cooperation between member states. The future instrument should respect the inalienable right to research into, develop and use nuclear energy for peaceful reasons, and establish provisions relating to international cooperation and assistance, including assistance to the victims of nuclear weapons. Cuba believes that none of the provisions of this instrument will or should be interpreted in such a way as they limit or declare void obligations made under the United Nations Treaty, commitments taken under the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or those made under the CTBT, the treaties on nuclear weapons-free zones, treaties on the prohibition of positioning nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction on the seabed, ocean beds and their subsoils, as well as the agreement which should govern states' activities on the moon and in outer space, and commitments made under the CTBT. To conclude, Madam President, Cuba calls upon all member states to join the negotiations on this instrument. We support their successful conclusion, the entry into force of commitments made, and their enforcement and implementation as quickly as possible. We also call upon all member states to demonstrate real commitment and genuine political will to the goal of achieving a world free of nuclear weapons. We support the appeal that has been made by non-governmental organizations to make 2017 the year of the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Many thanks.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Ahora al distinguido representante.
I now give the floor to the distinguished delegation of Colombia. Many thanks, Madam Chair. Ambassador Elaine White, I wish to congratulate you on your election as the president of this important meeting. We endorse the statement made by El Salvador on behalf of CELAC. Allow me also to reiterate the unstinting commitment of Colombia to the historic task which was being entrusted to us today, that is to move forward with the negotiations on a legally binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons and which leads to their total elimination. On the 6th of August in 1986, in Ixtapa, Mexico, at a time at which we were still living through the Cold War, and 4 months after the devastating nuclear disaster of Chernobyl, the Nobel Literature Laureate Gabriel García Márquez spoke before the meeting on disarmament, which was held in this town, Ixtapa, Mexico, to mark the 41st anniversary of the launch of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. I'd like, if I may, to here quote a passage from his heart-rending speech, which was entitled The Cataclysm of Damocles, because it contains, most likely like no other, fundamental, essential thoughts which I hope will inspire the work of this conference. I quote, "1 minute after the last explosion, more than half of the human beings will have died. Dust and smoke of continents in flames will defeat the sunlight, and absolute darkness will once again reign throughout the world. A winter of orange rain and frozen hurricanes will upturn the rhythms of the oceans and alter the courses of rivers whose fishes will have died of thirst, and whose birds will not once again discover the sky. Perpetual snow will once again discover the deserts of the Sahara, and the vast Amazon region will disappear off the face of the earth. It will be destroyed by hail, and the era of rock and stone and transplanted hearts will one again return to their icy childhood. The very few human beings that do survive and will only have saved their lives to then die later from the horror of their memories. Creation will have finished. In the ultimate chaos, the final chaos of humidity and eternal nights, the only vestige of what was life will be cockroaches." Madam Chair, That's the end of that quotation. Madam President, it is regrettable to note that today the world continues to live under the constant threat of nuclear war, and it is regrettable to note that the words of the Colombian writer are as relevant today as the time at which they were written. The catastrophic humanitarian consequences of a nuclear explosion, either intentional or accidental, would affect the planet as a whole, with regardless of the region in which it takes place. As the vast majority of the international community demands, mechanisms for and multilateral tools must produce results in line with their mandates. Patience in the face of the gridlock of the disarmament machinery has now been exhausted, and the time has now come to move forward with decisive action towards general, complete and irreversible disarmament. Madam Chair, Colombia is party to the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and Caribbean, known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco. This is pioneering at a regional level, and it instituted the first nuclear weapons-free zone in a region such as ours, so densely populated. The treaty marked its 50th anniversary on the 14th of February and has made and does make an invaluable contribution to peace, regional peace and security, nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, cooperation and integration among states in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is for this reason that Colombia endorses the proposal to move forward on the negotiations of a legally binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons. This instrument must be universal in nature, clearly so. It must lay down basic prohibitions and institute basic obligations which must fall upon the shoulders of all states who wish to become party to it, and establish a legal architecture which is propitious to the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. It must be based on existing instruments and institute new incremental commitments which are irreversible in nature. Colombia reaffirms its respect for and commitment to the Tlatelolco treatment and the NPT, and its three pillars. We believe that these three pillars will continue and should continue to be the cornerstone of any efforts to move towards general disarmament. Nuclear weapons states should continue to be brought on board with dialogue. Indeed, them being involved in such dialogue will be crucial if we are to reach our end goal of disarmament. Delegates, we should prioritize all efforts which move towards the universalization of the ban on nuclear weapons. We should be sensitive and creative when it comes to overcoming our challenges. We should promote confidence-building measures which foster trust between nuclear weapons-free states and those who do not possess nuclear weapons. We should bear in mind that our work should strengthen the three pillars which exist under the NPT and should look to strengthen Article 6 of the NPT, an article which obliges us to hold negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to nuclear disarmament. Creating a nuclear weapons-free world is a shared responsibility of all states. However, this responsibility is common and collective, but states have differentiated roles and functions. States who do not have nuclear weapons play a role in the promotion of nuclear disarmament at a global level, while nuclear weapon states have a particular responsibility in achieving and promoting effective nuclear disarmament. Madam Chair, I don't think any of us here today remember how it is to live in a world without nuclear weapons. And against the backdrop of this conference, we invite you to do everything you can and do everything we can indeed to ensure that we do not see the apocalyptic epilogue written by García Márquez become a reality. You have Colombia's support in attempting to save the planet from the outcome outlined in the Cataclysm of Damocles. Many thanks indeed. I thank the distinguished representative of Colombia. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Dominican Republic to the United Nations.
Señora Presidente.
Madam Chair, President, for the Dominican Republic, it is an honor to see a distinguished daughter of our region at the helm of this process of international negotiations. By their very nature, we believe that these negotiations are already a historic milestone. I wish to endorse the statement made by the distinguished ambassador of El Salvador on behalf of the countries of CELAC. As since the successive review conferences of the states parties to the TNP. There has been no doubt that we have seen the development of a growing movement to ensure the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The documents of the review conferences indicate, and I quote, a deep concern for or about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, end quote. And these outcome documents reaffirm, and I quote, the need to ensure that all states at all times comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law, end quote. The Dominican Republic endorses and joins the strong appeal of many states to undertake in good faith and conclude in an urgent fashion and in a decisive fashion negotiations to prohibit the use of nuclear weapons and completely eliminate them through a legally binding international agreement. Madam President, bearing in mind the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the Dominican Republic attaches the utmost importance to this type of international negotiations. Our country acknowledges the efforts made by several countries within the international community. These countries have played host to several important international meetings on nuclear disarmament and their humanitarian impact. These are meetings which have involved the representatives of many other countries, international agencies, civil society, religious organizations, activists, doctors, scientists, members of academia, and other experts. These important fora have, and there can be no doubt about this, lent dynamism to the global campaign looking to prohibit all nuclear weapons. This aim, in our view, is a real challenge for global society as it looks to ensure peace and human security. Madam President, human suffering caused by the possible use of nuclear weapons will affect several generations. We believed that this assertion should be a historical starting point from which we adopt urgent measures in order to prohibit and eliminate nuclear weapons. According to the opinions expressed by eminent experts and scientists at an international level, no state or international organization would today be able to adequately and appropriately deal with the immediate humanitarian emergency caused by a detonation of nuclear weapons, or to offer the necessary assistance to those affected by such a detonation. In fact, it has been indicated that it might not be possible that to establish or create this capacity, even if attempts were made to do just that. For this reason, the international community represented here today in this important forum of the United Nations must continue to act as a significant driving force which allowed the adoption of treaties such as Tlatelolco. The 50th anniversary of this treaty is something we're very proud to celebrate. In 1967, at the height of the Cold War, our region of Latin America and the Caribbean was a pioneer in encouraging the creation of a nuclear weapons-free zone. This initiative was followed by other similar ones in Africa, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, and Central Asia. These nuclear weapons-free zones have, over time, demonstrated that they are more successful than the slow steps lacking conviction undertaken by a number of nuclear weapons states. Madam President, we are aware that a detonation of nuclear weapons would not be an act contained within national borders. It would affect states and people in a significant way, both at a regional and global level. We call for a realistic and achievable commitment to be made, and one which would make it possible to create the conditions for a nuclear weapons-free world as a key ingredient to defend life and protect its values. Many thanks. I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Uruguay to the United Nations.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Doy las gracias al presidente interino.
Many thanks, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank the Interim President of the General Assembly and the High Representative of Disarmament Affairs, and I would also like to thank those who the other people who have made statements today. Given that this is the first time that Uruguay is taking the floor at this conference, we wish to congratulate you and the other members of the Bureau on your election. We wish you every success in your work, and we assure you that you can count on the full support of our delegation.
Nos asociamos al discurso pronunciado.
We endorse the statement made by El Salvador on behalf of CELAC. For Uruguay, the convening of a United Nations conference for the negotiation of a binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons and leads to their total elimination is particularly important, and this meeting is indeed a key forum for multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations. This meeting is also a valuable opportunity which we can use to begin to sketch a roadmap which will lead us to a world free of nuclear weapons. Madam President, Uruguay is a nuclear weapons-free state. It is a member of the first nuclear weapons-free zone established by the Treaty of Tlatelolco. Uruguay is also a member of the Zone of Peace and Cooperation of the South Atlantic, SOPACAS, and party to the NPT. Consequently, Uruguay is committed to strengthening the disarmament and non-proliferation regime, and we champion efforts made to ensure a world free of nuclear weapons. Uruguay's foreign policy prioritizes and promotes the need to continue moving forward with universal and transparent negotiations which will see the participation of all countries regardless of their size and power in order to achieve general and complete disarmament under a strict international regime. Madam President, the NPT is the cornerstone of the disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation regime. The NPT must be balanced. The application of its three pillars must be balanced. These are disarmament, non-proliferation, and the peaceful use of nuclear energy. It is crucial to achieve the total elimination and prohibition of all nuclear weapons, and to ensure that we achieve the effective implementation of Article 6 of the NPT. This article enshrines the commitment to hold negotiations in good faith on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. For this reason, greater, deeper commitment is necessary, as is greater political will of all countries in the world, given that we are all responsible, states that have nuclear weapons and states that do not have them. The responsibility is a collective one. In this connection, the negotiation of a legally binding instrument which prohibits nuclear weapons and leads to their total elimination, as established by Resolution 71258 of the General Assembly, would complement the provisions of the NPT, and in no way should it weaken this treaty. It should and would strengthen the current regime of non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, and would plug the existing legal loophole. The use and threat of use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity and a violation of international law, including international humanitarian law. Such acts are also a violation of the United Nations Charter. The only guarantee against the use and threat of use of these weapons is their expressed prohibition and their total elimination. To conclude, Madam President, we reaffirm our commitment to contribute to the collective responsibility of leaving no stone unturned in order to move towards the overarching goal of achieving general and complete disarmament in line with the principles contained in the United Nations Charter. Many thanks, Madam President.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of Uruguay, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of South Africa to the United Nations.
Madam President, let me from the outset join the other delegations in congratulating you, Ambassador Wyatt Gomez, on your election as the President of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. I wish to assure you of South African full support and cooperation towards fulfilling the mandate of this conference. My delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by the distinguished representative of Cape Verde on behalf of the African Group. Madam President, since the dawn of its democracy in 1994, South Africa has placed greater priority to multilateralism as the best way to deal with the issues of international peace and security, and as the only country to date to have voluntarily eliminated its nuclear weapons, South Africa has been an ardent supporter of nuclear disarmament. Our experience clearly demonstrated that the very existence of nuclear weapons means that humanity continues to face the peril of a nuclear catastrophe, and all states have the shared responsibility to prevent the use of such weapons by any actor under any circumstances. Together with the vast majority of states, South Africa believes that the only guarantee against the use of or threat of use of posed by nuclear weapons is their total elimination and legally binding assurances that they will never be used or produced again. Madam President, the argument that nuclear weapons are indispensable for the security of some states but not for the others is not only illogical, but it is morally unethical and lacks credibility. The resistance by nuclear armed states to fulfill their disarmament obligations and commitments has caused serious division among states and created a credibility crisis in the nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation regime. Consequently, the 20 years stalemate in the Conference on Disarmament and the lack of progress in the UN Disarmament Commission in particular has negatively impacted on multilateralism and has become a source of growing frustration among the vast majority of the United Nations member states. Madam President, since joining NPT in 1991 as a non-nuclear weapons state, South Africa has played an active role in promoting the inextricability linked pillars of treaty and their balanced implementation. We have for many years cautioned against a selective approach and expressed concern regarding the lack of equal attention to the disarmament obligation under Chapter 6 of the treaty. My country has also been an active participant in the humanitarian initiative on nuclear weapons since its inception in 2010, when some NPT member state parties again felt the necessity to prepare for the unthinkable possibilities of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. Over the last 7 years, the initiative gained wide support, with around 160 states declaring that nuclear weapons should never be used again under any circumstances, while around 130 states having committed towards filling the legal gap for the prohibition of the nuclear weapons. While we had hoped that this initiative will unite all states around the imperative for urgent movement on nuclear disarmament and assist breaking the 2-decade-long deadlock in the Conference on Disarmament, it is regrettable that most nuclear weapon states decided not to engage in the discussions. Some non-nuclear weapons states also delivered joint statements recognizing the consequences of a nuclear weapon detonation, but rejecting the aspiration for nuclear weapon states never to be used, for nuclear weapons never to be used again under any circumstances, which they argue contradict their security policies under extended deterrence. It is somewhat ironic that some of these states decided to ignore the security dimension of the humanitarian initiative, which illustrates that nuclear weapons are of interest and a security concern for all states and peoples of the world, and not just for the few possessing such inhumane and indiscriminate instruments. Madam President, this conference, in our view, constitutes a major milestone in the history of nuclear disarmament, and the only reason for our presence here today is to negotiate an instrument that will prohibit nuclear weapons. While nuclear weapons have been subjected to regional prohibition through nuclear-free zones such as the Pelindaba Treaty, this will be the first international legal instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons the only weapon of mass destruction yet to be subjected to a global prohibition. This conference is therefore indeed a historic event. Madam President, the negotiation during this conference will allow all states to finally give concrete effect to the aspirations expressed in the very first resolution, A/RES/1, adopted by UN General Assembly more than 70 years ago. It is worth recalling the significant progress made towards the elimination of all chemical and biological weapons through international prohibitions. We therefore welcome this conference as a significant step towards subjecting nuclear weapons to the same international norms as the other categories of weapons of mass destruction. In South Africa's view, such a treaty is both a practical and achievable step towards filling a glaring gap in the international legal architecture pertaining to the legality of nuclear weapons. Our support for such a step is without prejudice to the realization of existing nuclear disarmament commitment, particularly those agreed to in the NPT context, including negotiations on other partial measures. Madam President, we hope that all states will seize this historic opportunity to engage in good faith in negotiations on effective measures. Contrary to the argument advanced by some, the negotiations on and conclusions of an international legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons cannot undermine the security interest of any state. A higher norm on nuclear weapons can only strengthen international security and advance the security of a world without such weapons. It is for this reason that South Africa supports a comprehensive prohibition that is based on principles and rules of international humanitarian law and the UN Charter. South Africa views the Berne Treaty as an important step towards achieving the ultimate goal of the world free of nuclear weapons. In this context, South Africa will further elaborate on the key elements of the future prohibition treaty during thematic debates. In conclusion, Madam President, my delegation looks forward to working with you and all delegations towards a successful conclusion of an effective, non-discriminatory, international legally binding treaty prohibiting weapons, nuclear weapons, leading to the total elimination. I thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias al
Many thanks to the distinguished representative of South Africa. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Egypt to the United Nations.
Madam President, let me at the outset congratulate you, Ambassador Gomez, on the assumption of the presidency of this historic conference. My delegation would like to associate itself with the statements delivered by Oman on behalf of the Arab group, as well as Cape Verde on behalf of the African group. As we inaugurate this first session today, we embark on a new crucial journey that has the potential to significantly advance disarmament objective and contribute to global peace and security. We are confident that with your able leadership, we will collectively steer this conference towards success despite the challenging task ahead. My delegation stands ready to provide all necessary support to ensure a successful conference. Madam President, for decades, Egypt has played a vocal and assertive role in the advancement of global nuclear disarmament. We have placed the highest priority to global, non-discriminatory, verifiable nuclear disarmament and the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. It has been Egypt's long-standing belief that nuclear weapons are a grave source of instability to the world order and a serious threat to humanity that warrants immediate global collective action to eliminate them without further delay. In various multilateral fora, Egypt has expressed its full and unwavering support to accelerate global action to achieve nuclear disarmament and will associate itself with international efforts that promote this objective. It is precisely for this reason that Egypt actively engaged in the 3rd session of the open-ended working group in Geneva last year and co-sponsored General Assembly Resolution 71/528. Which called on the United Nations to hold this conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. In line with Egypt policy, this historic resolution has paved the way to develop a new legal framework for the prohibition of nuclear weapons and accordingly could signify a milestone in the global nuclear disarmament architecture. The new instrument, in our view, should be ambitious and comprehensive in nature. It should be modeled in a manner that not only creates a global norm prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons, but more importantly, its possessions, and serve as an instrument that leads towards their total elimination to achieve complete nuclear disarmament. Madam President, Egypt strongly supports the commencement of negotiation for a new legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Let me outline 6 specific points why we support this process. First, a new instrument would formalize the categorical rejection of the possession and use of the nuclear weapons and would complement already existing legal instruments. A new non-discriminatory legal instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons would be a significant addition to the body of law governing weapons of mass destruction. It should set a framework for elimination of nuclear weapons within agreed timeframes. Second, a new instrument would further solidify the international denunciation of nuclear weapons. By concluding a new instrument prohibiting and eliminating nuclear weapons, the international community would further delegitimize the possession of use of nuclear weapons and reinforce the global norm against their acquisition and discredit those that justify their possessions. Third, a new instrument would emphasize once again the urgency and criticality of realizing a world free of nuclear weapons. It would underscore the growing international condemnation and disapproval of nuclear weapons and place greater pressure on the nuclear weapon states to fulfill the legal obligation to nuclear disarmament. Fourth, a new instrument would significantly challenge the conceptual rationale for nuclear deterrence as a safeguard for national or regional security. It would potentially encourage the reconsideration of military doctrines that rely on nuclear weapons and reinvigorate global determination to eliminate them while renew focus on their severe humanitarian consequences. Fifth, a new instrument would address the extensive humanitarian consequences of any nuclear detonation, whether intentionally or accidental, not only in a given state, but also within the regional geographic proximity. By prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons, we would avert the catastrophic effects of nuclear detonations. 6. A new instrument would highlight the lack of fulfillment by nuclear weapon states of their commitment towards nuclear disarmament as explicitly stipulated in Article 6 of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It will shed light on their passiveness when it comes to nuclear disarmament, while inject further impetus in international efforts to achieve comprehensive nuclear disarmament and reinforce the global norm against nuclear weapons. Madam President, the disturbing reality is that thousands of nuclear weapons continue to exist in the world today. They continue to feature highly in strategic military doctrines. They are deployed in the territories of certain non-nuclear weapon states. New generation of such weapons continue to be developed, and nuclear deterrence remains a defining characteristic of certain military alliances. This action undeniably have undermined the nuclear disarmament regime and have posed some serious questions regarding not only the sincerity of nuclear weapon states toward nuclear disarmament, but their compliance with the provisions of the NPT. It is important to point out that the lack of progress in implementing Article 6 of the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the growing frustration with nuclear weapon states to live up to their share of the NPT grand bargain has naturally compelled the international community to embark on this new process which we inaugurate today. This process would not have been necessary had nuclear weapon states manifested throughout the past 4 decades serious and persistent political will to achieve nuclear disarmament. Rather than criticize the new process, question its practicality, and denounce its consequences, those opposed to this new initiative ought to realize that it was the very passivity and indifference toward achieving one of the NPT's main pillars, namely nuclear disarmament, that ultimately gave birth to this new process. Madam President, as I look around this hall today, I can't help but notice some vacant seats At a time when the international community comes together to take global collective action to prohibit and eliminate an entire category of abhorrent weapons, we find it unfortunate that some states, but in particular the nuclear weapon state, opt to boycott this conference. If this suggests anything, it is a clear indicative, yet again, of the questionable commitment of the nuclear weapon states towards nuclear disarmament and create a clear delineation between those that are willing to promote collective security as opposed to selective security. Finally, Madam President, this new process which we inaugurate today therefore represent light at the end of the tunnel, a significant opportunity that must not be squandered to reinforce the global nuclear disarmament architecture until we reach global zero. Egypt stands ready to engage in this process with the energy and commitment it deserves, simply because there is a significant distinction between hollow words of the past century and real actions of today. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations. Thank you.
Madam President, at the outset, allow me to congratulate you warmly on your role as President of this historic conference and to extend those congratulations to the members of your Bureau and the Secretariat. My delegation assures you that we are ready to work with you and your team to ensure a productive, effective and successful outcome. We especially welcome the role for civil society in these negotiations, as promised in the resolution to establish this conference. We wouldn't have reached this point without the support and advocacy of our civil society partners, and we welcome their full and active engagement with us. In the interests of brevity and knowing that many delegates will wish to speak today, we'll lodge a longer text for the record. Madam President, the word historic is overused these days, but I believe that this is one of those moments in time when it is truly deserved and warranted. This is a moment when the past demands something of the present. We are here to answer that imperative call for action. Almost 30 years since the first UN resolution on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, tabled by my country, Ireland, and following a long and noble path of advocacy, testimony and leadership by civil society, survivors, experts, academics and a clear majority of states, we have reached the moment when we begin to negotiate here at the UN a prohibition treaty on the only remaining weapons of mass destruction not yet subject to a ban. We do so in the knowledge that this is the first such multilateral negotiation to address nuclear weapons in over 20 years. We do so in the context of no perceptible progress in the implementation of Article 6 of the NPT, a treaty which was indefinitely extended in 1995 and will soon be 50 years old. And we do so against a backdrop when the taboo on the threat of use is worryingly much higher than it has been in a very long time, as is the risk of an actual detonation of a nuclear weapon, either accidentally or on purpose, as an act of war or of terror, through human or cyber threat. This, then, is a pivotal point in our international relations, a time to take stock and to honour the testimony of the past, to decide what sort of present we wish to live in and what sort of legacy we wish to leave for future generations. We're not just writing a new and complementary treaty here. We are taking the opportunity to write a new history, and in so doing to create a new, more stable, more secure and more equal future for all. We could not have reached this historic moment without a great deal of effort by a wide range of committed and, dare I say, visionary leaders and advocates. For vision and leadership is what has been required to reach this point of action, often in the face of great adversity, negativity and opposition. It is important to stress that this vision has been a positive and a proactive one, and is steeped in the documented evidence of the humanitarian consequences of these weapons. Speaking for my delegation, we do not develop our policies out of frustration. We act on the evidence, on our clear obligations and commitments under international law, and our moral and ethical responsibilities as citizens in a global world order. My delegation can trace our engagement on this issue back for almost 20 years. Indeed, nuclear disarmament has been a priority for the Government of Ireland, our Parliament and our people from the outset of our membership of the United Nations. This historic commitment goes to the very heart of our belief in a rules-based international world order and the important and indeed essential leadership role for small states within that order, where all voices can be heard. In these challenging times, what is certain is that we must remain true to the principles which serve us best, those which led to the creation of the UN itself, and those which continue to serve as its guiding force today, principles of peacemaking, of mutual respect, of human rights, and of shared responsibility. The equilibrium of world order cannot be held in place and is not currently held in place by either threat or fear, in fact quite the reverse, and a permanent peace can only ever be attained through respect for the rule of law based on justice. To quote our former Foreign Minister Frank Aiken, speaking at the UN in 1958, "The achievement of peace based on law requires positive sacrifices, which may not be forthcoming, but which it is our duty to seek, each according to our ability and influence. Nuclear disarmament may, as we have been told, be a challenge for large states with nuclear weapons, but it's equally important and, under the NPT, just as much a responsibility for small states with no nuclear weapons, a responsibility on which my delegation is acting in our engagement with these negotiations. As we begin our important work here, we cannot ignore the wider security situation. There has been a worrying decrease in the taboo around threat of use. There are persistent, illegal nuclear tests. There is vast investment in so-called modernization, with talk of more strategic, more targeted, more usable nuclear weapons, and increased reliance on those weapons in security doctrines. The very idea that any nuclear weapon could ever be used again, and in some sort of controlled way, is one of the most dangerous to have emerged in the current discourse. Nuclear weapons are the most powerful and most indiscriminate weapons of mass destruction ever invented. Knowing what we know now about their catastrophic consequences and the impossibility of any adequate humanitarian response, we must reject the premise that they can ever be used again under any circumstances. All of our shared work on the Sustainable Development Goals and on the great challenge of migration, as well as climate change, has reinforced again that we are many countries, but one small shared planet. Nuclear weapons respect no borders, and their effects can be controlled by nobody. Ireland is pleased to be hosting an event here at the UN on Tuesday in conjunction with the Future of Life Institute to hear from leading scientists on the risks associated with these weapons and the threat that they pose us all. Madam President, you've invited us to speak about our objectives for our work. Our starting point should be the UN resolution, which is our mandate for this diplomatic conference, namely to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination. If we unpack this text, then we have some clear parameters with which to define our work. Firstly, what we are negotiating here is a legal instrument. It is more than a political declaration, and it will need to be given legal effect in our own national systems. As a new legal instrument, it doesn't exist in a vacuum, and will need to take account of and indicate how it will complement and support the existing body of law and other instruments. The core objective is the prohibition of the weapons. The first time these weapons of mass destruction will be clearly and unambiguously prohibited, addressing the current legal gap. We need to continue to reiterate that these weapons are inhumane, indiscriminate, and beyond any possible legal use. Our focus is on the weapon and not on the actor. Our mandate also refers to leading towards their total elimination, so the treaty will need to indicate its place in this pathway, in which it is a step with many others required. From these starting points, grounded in the resolution, we can develop the treaty provisions and necessary supports, and I think that the agenda, timetable, and programme of work you've developed provides us with the opportunity to do so. We know that change only comes about when the status quo becomes less comfortable, when the discomfort of doing something new becomes less than keeping things the same. As we take on the responsibility of making this change happen, we hope that many more states will join in this endeavour. We welcome the broad and brave participation from states here today, including those less developed states and smaller states whose voices, including many female voices, were so powerful and so necessary at the open-ended working group in Geneva. We know that many others will be watching today's meeting, some who may have already made up their minds, and we would appeal to them to remain open to the possibility of change, to see that our work here is in the interest of all of our humanity, all of our hopes, all of our security. We would encourage them once again to join us in this common endeavour, if not now, then in June and July, as we work together to build mutual understanding and to create a better future on the right side of history. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante.
I thank the permanent representative of Ireland. And I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela to the United Nations. Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we convey to you our most sincere congratulations on your election. Rest assured, we are delighted that we have acknowledged the right of Palestine and the Holy See to participate on an equal footing to all sovereign states in this conference, which is so vital for saving human life. Our country endorses the statement made by the Ambassador of El Salvador on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC. Venezuela is committed to the cause of nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. As such, we co-sponsored the resolution which gave rise to the convening of this conference, and as a state party to the Treaty on a Zone Free of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America and Caribbean, known as the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which has just celebrated its 50th anniversary, we share the deep concern expressed regarding the threat to humankind which is constituted by the existence of nuclear weapons as well as by the detonation of these weapons. Madam President, the position expressed by a small group of countries, the United States, the United Kingdom and Canada, in the closing session of the NPT Review Conference of 2015 against the adoption of new measures on the process to establish a zone free of nuclear weapons and all other weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East represents a clear example of how biased and selfish interests of a small handful of countries interfere to the detriment of the common good of humankind. The expression of this position is proof of the clear intention of a number of countries to undermine multilateral mechanisms for disarmament and non-proliferation. Today, we are meeting together in this illustrious conference to deal with the most serious of threats hovering over humankind, and we are doing so in the absence of nuclear weapon states and in the absence of those who benefit from these weapons and use them for their supposed security. But we are not meeting in vain. Establishing nuclear weapons-free zone across the world without reserves or without conditions is one of the specific steps forward on negotiating this treaty on the banning of nuclear weapons. We all hope that this treaty will come into being. There is recent scientific evidence from the most sophisticated models of climate change and this evidence indicates that even a regional and limited nuclear war, a war limited to the use of 100 nuclear bombs with the capacity of Hiroshima, the equivalent of 0.03% of the existing global nuclear power, would not only claim the lives of tens of millions of persons as a result of the explosion and radiation emanating from these weapons, rather such a war would also see climactic consequences which would continue for 1 decade or more. Globally speaking, more than 1 billion people could die of hunger and many more would die of epidemics and die as a result of the social and economic turbulence which would arise from such a regional and limited nuclear war. Whichever way we look at it, achieving a world free of nuclear weapons is an unavoidable imperative to ensure the survival of humankind. In this connection, we see the adoption of a legally binding instrument on the prohibition of nuclear weapons as a supplement to and complement to and buttress to Article 6 of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT. It will provide specific guidance regarding effective concrete measures which must be adopted to comply with commitments taken to achieve nuclear disarmament. At the same time, we believe that this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons has to build on the provisions enshrined in Resolution 68/32 of the General Assembly, tabled by the non-aligned movement. This resolution proposes convening by 2018 at the latest an international high-level United Nations conference to examine the elements of a comprehensive convention on nuclear weapons, which would establish broad general obligations, prohibitions and practical provisions for nuclear disarmament which would be irreversible and verifiable in nature within tangible specific timeframes. Madam President, nothing in this treaty which we are beginning to negotiate must limit the inalienable right of all states to develop all aspects of nuclear science and technology for peaceful purposes without discrimination, in line with Article 4 of the NPT. Moreover, we believe that a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons must include at least the following ingredients. A ban on the acquisition, possession, stockpiling, development, testing and production of nuclear weapons. B, a ban on allowing nuclear weapons to enter national territory, including a ban on permitting ships with nuclear weapons on board to enter ports and territorial waters, and a ban on allowing aircraft with nuclear weapons on board to enter national airspace, and a ban on allowing nuclear weapons to circulate through on national territory, and a ban on allowing these to be stationed or deployed on national territory. There should also be a ban on participating in the planning of a nuclear war, including a ban on the establishment of security doctrines which justify the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons, and the establishment of nuclear alliances, such as, for example, the strategic concept for the defence and security of NATO members. D, we should include the recognition of victims of the use and tests of nuclear weapons, paying greater attention to security and contamination problems linked to the nuclear programs of nuclear weapon states. And we should enshrine the commitment to provide assistance to the victims of nuclear weapons, including commitments to ensuring the restoration of the environment and a commitment to ensure the safe resettlement of anybody displaced by nuclear weapons, and a commitment to restoring the economic productivity of the areas affected by nuclear weapons. We acknowledge the fact that particular responsibility should be shown towards the peoples and areas affected in the non-self-governing territories of the United Nations affected by the use of nuclear weapons, and to those people who've been affected by a nuclear test in the past. Madam President, we understand the pressing need to adopt a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, but we cannot ignore the importance of bearing in mind the international security environment as it stands today, as well as the current geopolitical situation, and efforts made to reduce levels of hostility and tension between states, in particular between those who possess nuclear weapons. Moreover, we continue to be deeply concerned by the negative consequences of the development and deployment of anti-ballistic missile defense systems. We are concerned by the threat of deploying weapons in outer space. Also, the deployment of such systems is of concern to us as a result of the negative consequences for security that this could have. Indeed, the deployment of such systems could trigger one or several arms races, as well as the further deployment of advanced missile systems, and it could trigger an increase in the number of nuclear weapons. We also emphasize the importance of ensuring strict compliance with existing agreements on limiting an arms race in outer space and agreements relative to disarmament in outer space. We also emphasize the need to ensure strict compliance with current legal regimes regarding the use of outer space as a whole. We wish to recall that while the most critical and urgent task of the moment is to eliminate the threat of a nuclear war, we cannot forget that true and genuine peace can only be achieved insofar as states make simultaneous progress in other crucial areas of the disarmament sphere in order to achieve general and complete disarmament. And progress can only be made if they abandon war and the threat of war as a way of ensuring their own interests prevail and ensuring that they resolve their differences. To conclude, we hope that nuclear weapon states, or those that host nuclear weapon states on their territory, demonstrate genuine, real political will. That will, an expression of that will, would begin by attending this conference to ensure that it's not simply a forum for discussion, but to ensure rather that this conference takes tangible decisions in order to ensure the prohibition of nuclear weapons and ultimately general and complete disarmament. Many thanks.
Muchas gracias. Le agradezco al
Many thanks to the distinguished representative of Venezuela. I give the floor to the representative of Libya.
In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Madam President, at the outset, I wish to express to you our warm congratulations on your assumption of the presidency of this historic conference. We are confident that by virtue of your experience and skill would have great impact to ensure the success of this forum. Our congratulations go to other members of the Bureau for their election. Let me assure you of our support in the course of the proceedings of this conference. Also, my delegation aligns itself with the statement made by the distinguished permanent representative of Oman on behalf of the Arab group and the statement by the distinguished representative of Cape Verde on behalf of the African group. Madam President, at long last, here we are negotiating on a legally binding instrument to prohibit a nuclear weapon, which has all along been an overarching concern for all states, given its catastrophic impact on the humankind, as well as the unspeakable humanitarian effects. Madam President, the vision of a world without nuclear weapons cannot be translated into a reality without genuine and concrete steps. And the global security environment makes it imperative upon us now more than ever before to reach to conclude an instrument to prohibit these weapons. Many regional efforts were made in order to establish nuclear weapon-free zones as well as other weapons of mass destruction in those respective regions, as what happened, for instance, in Africa, Latin America. Those efforts led to treaties that made those zones virtually free of those nuclear weapons. But we in the Middle East region made enormous efforts, and we agreed to hold an international conference for this purpose, but some states aborted the convening of this conference. Madam President, reaching a legally binding instrument through viable and effective legal arrangements in order to prohibit nuclear weapons would go a long way in our efforts that call for nuclear disarmament. Also, it will contribute to the implementation of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which provides for the continuation of negotiations in good faith towards nuclear disarmament. And this would help the implementation of this major provision. The ever-increasing frustration over the failure of the international community to proceed forward through the existing multilateral mechanisms for nuclear weapons disarmament was one of many reasons that led to take legal steps in order to prohibit effectively this weapon. Despite all that, we support all efforts undertaken within international multilateral frameworks in order to reinforce the efforts aiming at nuclear disarmament. Madam President, we reiterate our commitment to NPT, and we consider it as a cornerstone in the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation structure. And we stress that the real threat to the future of this treaty is in the continuation by the states possessing nuclear weapons and their rejection to end feasible measures in order. In closing, Madam President, we hope that this round would be the beginning of efforts to achieve our goal to eliminate all nuclear weapons, and that our efforts would be culminated with 6. By consensus, adopt this instrument in order to ensure its universality, and this would mean that this would require good faith and earnest political will to attain that goal. Thank you.
Le agradezco al distinguido representante de Libia.
I thank the distinguished representative of Libya and now give the floor to the ambassador from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Kazakhstan.
Thank you. Distinguished Chair, Your Excellencies, colleagues and representatives of civil society. First of all, let me congratulate Madam Chair. I am confident that under your leadership we will arrive at an agreed and substantive outcome document. Ladies and gentlemen, in September 2015, in New York, the President of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, told the international community that a world without nuclear weapons should be the main goal of humanity in the 21st century. Our collective ambition should be that by the 100th anniversary of UN, our world should be completely free from a nuclear threat. In this context, I would like to draw your attention to the manifesto, The World 21st Century, proposed by President Nazarbayev. This document and its program, 21st Century, A World Without Wars, warns against lethargy and indifference. The international community has, of course, taken steps to nuclear disarmament. Many UNGA resolutions call for a nuclear weapons-free world. This includes the Universal Declaration on a Nuclear Weapons-Free World initiated by Kazakhstan. It was supported by a majority of UN member states and was an important step towards a legally binding international instrument for the prohibition and elimination of nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan, as a leading advocate of this important global cause, also strongly supported the final document of the open-ended working group on nuclear disarmament and the UN General Assembly resolution on the convening of today's conference. The convening was made possible mainly due to process begun by the conferences on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons in Oslo, Nairobi, and Vienna. As a country that continues to experience the consequences of nuclear explosions, we strongly believe that in the forthcoming document on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the principle of responsibility for the humanitarian consequences of their use needs to be implemented. We also consider that, along with all the elements around the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the draft document should have provisions for some form of verification of their possession by countries. Ladies and gentlemen, Kazakhstan has consistently supported the legitimatization of nuclear weapons and repeatedly called for complete nuclear disarmament. We regard the future nuclear weapon ban treaty as an interim measure in this process. Kazakhstan advocates the launch of negotiations for concluding the comprehensive nuclear weapon convention with the provisions on the irreversible and verifiable elimination of nuclear weapons within a specific time frame. Additionally, we believe the comprehensive convention should only be considered at the Conference on Disarmament, involving all concerned states. We consider that despite its existing difficulties, this forum has a huge potential and can make a significant contribution to the disarmament process. At the same time, the global delegitimization process should not be stopped due to the forced inactivity of the Conference on Disarmament because of its existing procedural contradictions. We believe the NPT remains a cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime. We hope that a new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons will supplement and strengthen the NPT, filling its existing gaps. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Kazakhstan was the leading mover in the Semipalatinsk Treaty, which established a nuclear-free weapons zone in Central Asia. Today, 116 states, the majority of UN members, are parties to nuclear weapon-free zones, which cover most of the territory of our planet. The purpose of today's conference should be to accelerate the transition of these zones from the regional to the global level, freeing our world from fear of nuclear threat. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Kazakhstan. I now give the floor to the Deputy Permanent Representative of Saudi Arabia to the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I would like to begin by congratulating Your Excellency on your election to preside over the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to ban nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The delegation of my country stresses its determination to fully cooperate with you to achieve success of your tasks during the work of this conference. Moreover, the delegation of my country aligns itself with the contents of the Statement of the Arab Group. Madam President, regional and international efforts related to nuclear disarmament are hopeful and optimistic in raising global awareness about the dangers of the proliferation of nuclear weapons and what it represents as a fundamental threat to humanity. Emanating from the commitment of Saudi Arabia to the provisions of the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law as a fundamental pillar of its foreign policy, the Kingdom attaches particular importance to the holding of such conference in the strengthening of the role of the United Nations in all areas, particularly with regard to peace and security issues and international nuclear disarmament. This emanates from the Kingdom's belief that this requires a genuine political will and strong determination from all states, in particular states possessing nuclear weapons. Madam President, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia stresses the importance of the efforts dedicated to achieve the goals of elimination of nuclear weapons, which began by realizing the need that the entire international community should adopt the already existing treaties and legal and ethical frameworks which aim to achieve a nuclear-free world, particularly in the Middle East. The establishment of security and stability in any region cannot be achieved through possession of mass destruction weapons, but can be achieved through cooperation and consultation between countries to strive towards development and progress and to avoid the race to own this devastating weapon. Therefore, the outcomes of this conference should strengthen the international treaties and agreements in this regard, such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia attaches great importance to atomic energy as a vital technology for many peaceful applications, from which we hope will benefit the Kingdom and humanity in general. However, we have to bear in mind the importance of adopting the best practices and safety procedures while adhering to the principles of nuclear non-proliferation, in addition to adhering to full transparency in implementing the safeguards of the agency. Moreover, it is of the same importance that we activate the Strategic Partnership Agreement with the Nuclear and Radiological Safety Commission of Finland as a strategic partner to provide the necessary technical support, knowledge and expertise. Despite the universality of the NPT and that it represents the cornerstone in building the international system for disarmament and non-proliferation, those international efforts within the multilateral framework are still below the required level, in a way that makes the political scene tinged with ambiguity. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia believes that the current stalling of the scene would make the situation more difficult, as the lack of tangible progress in the elimination of nuclear weapons has been pushing towards the slide into the nuclear arms race. While many regions are experiencing success in the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zones because of their cooperation and realization of the inevitability of peaceful and safe coexistence, we still find that the Middle East defies international and regional efforts to make it a nuclear-free zone. It is really unfortunate that international consensus and a persistent regional desire in making the Middle East a zone free of nuclear weapons exists, but Israel stands in the way of the desire of the peoples of the region to live in nuclear terror-free zone. Our situation in the Middle East lies between Israel's rejection of any effort in this area and Iran's illegitimate ambition to acquire nuclear weapons, to dominate the region and to interfere in the internal affairs of the region's other countries. My country hopes that the agreement that has been reached between the major powers and Iran concerning the latter's nuclear program will ensure security and stability in the region and the world. In this context, the Kingdom emphasizes the legitimate right of the countries in the region in the peaceful use of nuclear energy in accordance with the standards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, its procedures, and under its supervision. We support the IAEA's efforts to consolidate and integrate the safeguards regime to verify the peacefulness of nuclear activities, while emphasizing that the agency is the only international entity empowered to verify the state's commitments related to safeguards. In conclusion, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is committed to the principles of nuclear disarmament and the relief of humanity from its devastating threat. My country stresses that the elimination of nuclear weapons is the certain guarantee against its use or threat of use. Moreover, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is of the view of taking the fear of many non-nuclear weapons countries seriously through developing a legally binding instrument to ban nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia to the United Nations, and I give the floor to the permanent representative of Indonesia to the United Nations.
Muchas gracias, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to commend you, Madam President, on your work leading up to this highly important conference. I am confident that under your able leadership, this conference will attain all its objectives. Allow me to also congratulate Mr. Thomas Malcolm, Secretary General of the conference, and all members of the Bureau. Rest assured of our full support and cooperation throughout the conference. I would like also to associate my delegation with the statement of the Philippines on behalf of the Association of Southeast Asian Nation, ASEAN. Madam President, nuclear disarmament is clearly one of the top international challenges. In this context, the convening of this conference is the culmination of decades of international endeavors on nuclear disarmament. Indonesia believes that the current international security environment is worrisome, partly due to the continued presence of nuclear weapons, which potentially can be used to threaten the security of neighboring countries as well as regional and global stability. Like many, Indonesia is deeply concerned by the catastrophic global impact of nuclear weapons to civilians. We believe that only the total elimination of nuclear weapons can guarantee against their use or threat of use. Therefore, we believe that the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons is not only important, but also of the utmost urgency. We are of the view that there should be a shift in the principles of nuclear disarmament, which, in addition to the humanitarian imperative, will further render the deterrence doctrine obsolete. There should be a shift from the current principle of undiminished security for all, which has provided elusive legitimation for the existence of nuclear weapons, to the principle of increased security for all. My country is of the conviction that the point when nuclear weapon states decide to forego their right to acquire nuclear weapon is the point when nuclear weapon states have the moral obligation to start the process of disarming their nuclear arsenals. The slow progress in nuclear disarmament underpins Indonesia's decision to support the convening of this important conference. In light of the ongoing frustration surrounding the lack of progress toward disarmament, strengthening the nuclear non-proliferation treaty regime would require mending the imbalance between the three pillars of the NPT. Indonesia believes that this negotiation on a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons is a clear path in that direction. Madam President, we should liberate humankind from the gridlock of the menace of nuclear catastrophe, either by design or by accident, due to the continued existence of nuclear weapons. As a strong proponent of nuclear disarmament, Indonesia expresses deep concern about the catastrophic humanitarian impact that could be inflicted upon millions and millions of human beings in the event of detonation of nuclear weapons. Such concerns, however, should never be interpreted as Indonesia's diminishing commitment and interest toward the continued existence and relevance of the NPT. In fact, like the majority of the NPT state parties, Indonesia believes that the NPT is an indispensable instrument to prevent global nuclear proliferation, with the eventual objective of achieving the total elimination of nuclear weapons. I would like to underline that Indonesia does not share some opinions stating that the negotiation on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons might somehow undermine the NPT. On the contrary, Indonesia is convinced that the negotiation on such a treaty will in fact strengthen the NPT. Complementary to the NPT, this treaty is aimed toward categorically and universally banning nuclear weapons. In light of this, Indonesia envisaged the treaty to affirm its mutually reinforcing nature with the NPT. Madam President, the time is high for the international community to view the threat of nuclear weapons in a concrete and tangible context, reflecting the three primary issues of our deliberation. Firstly, our principal objective should be set no less than to eliminate and further to delegitimize the development, possession, transfer, and use of nuclear weapons by anyone, by any means, against anyone, for any purposes on this planet, in its orbits, atmosphere, air, oceans, underwaters, inland, ashore, seabed, subterranean, etc. Secondly, the legal provision and norms of the treaty should be firm, strong, and unambiguous. The possession of nuclear weapon is in itself bears the potential and consequences of inflicting massive number of human casualties. Moreover, nuclear weapons can cause wanton destruction of cities, towns, or villages, and devastation not justified by military necessity. Who can guarantee that civilians not fall victim as collateral damage? That particular line is indisputably consistent to the menacing city-busting nuclear weapons, sitting coldly in their underground silos, ready to be launched at any moment's notice, with targeted cities pre-programmed in their guidance system. I wish to make it very clear that in the context of nuclear warfare, the so-called military necessity and the quotation would in that sense comprise of none other than the threat of somebody else's nuclear weapons. That is the vicious circle that this process should break once and for all. Certainly, the most pertinent question above anything would be on how we should organize the implementation and enforcement of those legal principles and norms. We must recognize that this might be the biggest question mark that this process needs to urgently answer. Either we must rely on current organizational modalities pertaining to nuclear weapons and/or energy, or build something from the scratch. Those are options that we need to ponder together. Let me conclude, Madam President, by calling all countries to be resilient, to hold steadfast to our primary goal, that is to liberate humanity from its man-made doomsday device, nuclear weapons and their menace. I plead on all around this room, it is time now to really do something on this particular issue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Jamaica to the United Nations.
Madam President, my delegation is pleased to see you presiding over our deliberations on such an auspicious and historic occasion. It is reassuring that the process in which we will be engaged during this and coming weeks will be led by someone of your experience and expertise. I assure you of Jamaica's full support. My delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of CARICOM and El Salvador on behalf of CELAC. Madam President, the convening of this historic conference has proven to be both timely and critical. It comes against a heightened level of global uncertainty and insecurity, even as the security policies of some continue to be underpinned by the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. The cumulative impact is that there has been a growing and palpable sense of dissatisfaction among the majority of non-nuclear weapon states like my own, with the failure of nuclear weapon states to live up to their obligations to implement the nuclear disarmament provisions contained in Article 6 of the NPT. Indeed, it is lamentable that 47 years after the entry into force of the NPT and 27 years after its indefinite extension, the international community is still unable to undertake negotiations in good faith on nuclear disarmament. This sense of frustration has been further exacerbated, most notably, by the fact that one of the key demands of non-nuclear weapon states parties to the NPT, which is that they will not be the target of the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons by nuclear weapon states, is yet to be rendered in a legally binding form. The situation assumes even greater urgency and significance as nuclear weapon states increasingly seek to justify their retention of nuclear weapons on security grounds, with the consequence that nuclear modernization programs continue apace and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence persists. Admittedly, important steps have been taken to limit and reduce the size of nuclear arsenals since the Cold War, primarily through bilateral agreements among key nuclear weapon states. The reality, however, is that the situation is still far from acceptable. Multilateral disarmament is beset by numerous obstacles and challenges. Not only are fora for multilateral nuclear disarmament largely deadlocked, but agreed steps, including the entry into force of the 1996 CTBT, have yet to be completed. The failure to implement the 13 steps from the 2000 NPT Review Conference, the lack of progress on the 2010 Action Plan, and the inability to obtain an agreed outcome at the 2015 Review Conference all reinforce the fact that urgent action needs to be taken by the international community. Madam, Mr. Filling-in President, as a state party to the NPT and the Treaty of Tlatelolco, Jamaica, together with its CARICOM partners, has supported calls and initiatives to pursue legal undertakings to advance the effective measures called for in Article 6 of the NPT. To this end, we are proud to be among the member states that co-sponsored Resolution 7033 on the establishment of the open-ended working group, which recommendations for this conference were overwhelmingly endorsed by the GA with the adoption of Resolution 71/258 late last year. Our call for the negotiation and adoption of a universally and legally binding instrument prohibiting the possession, development, production, acquisition, testing, stockpiling, transfer, and use and threat of use of nuclear weapons has consistently been underpinned by our belief that this should take full account of the principles of transparency, irreversibility, and verifiability. As a small island developing state, Jamaica views the prospects of a nuclear detonation, whether by design or accident, as an existential horror that could decimate the entire Caribbean region. We have, therefore, expressed deep concern about the humanitarian impact and the long-term consequences on the public health, food security, social services, infrastructure, environmental assets, and psychological well-being of our citizens. We have joined with other CARICOM states to place humanitarian concerns at the forefront of the discourse and action on nuclear weapons, including its inclusion on the agenda of the First Committee. Against this background, Jamaica has supported the special declarations on commitment to advance multilateral nuclear disarmament adopted by the heads of state and government of Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as the endorsement of the humanitarian pledge made at the Vienna Conference in December 2014. While the obligation under Article 6 of the NPT is the only legally binding multilateral nuclear disarmament provision and hence the general basis for multilateral nuclear disarmament efforts, it does not provide specific guidance either on the kind of negotiations that should be pursued in good faith or on what the effective measures relating to the cessation of nuclear arms race should be. For my delegation, therefore, there is a gap in the treaty with respect to the specific legal and non-legal measures that are required for the fulfillment of Article 6. Additionally, and in contrast to the regimes governing other weapons of mass destruction, biological and chemical, for example, as well as those governing conventional weapons such as landmines and cluster munitions, the nuclear regime does not comprehensively or categorically prohibit nuclear weapon-related activities. International law applicable to nuclear weapons does not include any comparable prohibitions. It is time to correct this unacceptable legal anomaly. Filling the legal gap requires the negotiation of a legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons. We see a global prohibition as closing this legal gap and addressing the ambiguity in nuclear governance, as well as strengthening the rule of law in this area. This includes building on the prohibitions in existing instruments, such as the NPT, nuclear weapon-free zones, and the CTBT. The global prohibition would also establish a universal norm against the possession, use, and stockpiling of nuclear weapons, thereby stigmatizing such weapons and discouraging horizontal and vertical proliferation. Weapons that are prohibited are increasingly viewed as illegitimate. They lose their political status, and with it the money and resources for their production, modernization, proliferation, and perpetuation. Indeed, a legally binding instrument of this nature would remove any doubt regarding the illegality of the use of nuclear weapons. The most effective way to ensure that nuclear weapons are never used is to abolish them. Consequently, Jamaica believes that the overarching objective of this treaty must be to achieve and maintain a world free of nuclear weapons. This can best be advanced through a comprehensive universal prohibition with an obligation to eliminate nuclear weapons. There must be a single comprehensive agreement on prohibition that leads towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. Establishing the elements for an international legally binding instrument will be the first step towards securing an agreement that meets our needs. It is therefore important that we get this first step right, as it will set the course as we navigate our route throughout the remainder of the negotiations. During this first session, we will undertake the important work of determining the principles on which the essential elements must be based and crafting a preamble setting out the goals and objectives of the treaty. We will need to identify the scope of an application The scope of application and the core prohibitions which we submit should be comprehensive. Other critical components of the treaty are provisions on national implementation measures, international cooperation and assistance, as well as institutional arrangements and compliance. We will also need to determine standard provisions of treaty law, such as signature, ratification, entry into force, duration and withdrawal, depository provisions and procedures for dispute settlement. Mr. President, Jamaica remains committed to its long-standing policy of advancing the goal of general and complete disarmament in pursuit of international peace, security, and sustainable development, and to the full and effective implementation of the 3 pillars of the NPT. We will continue to be strongly supportive of the process and committed to the initiatives of the international community to address issues related to the international peace and security. I take this opportunity to acknowledge the dedication and commitment of civil society in this ongoing effort to address this issue. Their resolve, determination, and unwavering support have been instrumental in getting us to this stage. It has been an arduous and at times frustrating journey, and we are conscious that we are only at the beginning of a new phase of our collective endeavor. However, the grave ramifications of the matter we will be considering over the next few days demand that we maintain our resolve to ensure that we protect future generations from the harm caused by these weapons. In closing, let me note, by way of observation, that Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, has been oft quoted by some in this country over the course of the past year. Allow me to recall, therefore, his words uttered during his 1984 State of the Union address. In speaking directly to the people of the then Soviet Union, he said, quote, "There is only one sane policy for your country and mine, to preserve our civilization in this modern age. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The only value in our two nations possessing nuclear weapons is to make sure they will never be used. But then, would it not be better to do away with them entirely?" End quote. Let me reiterate and assure you, Mr. President, of my delegation's commitment to working constructively with you so that we realize this common objective. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Jamaica and have the honor to give the floor now to the permanent representative of Cambodia.
Mr. President, first of all, I wish to join other colleagues to wholeheartedly congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the UN conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. We appreciate your efforts on responsibility of this conference. While aligning myself with the statement delivered by the Philippines on behalf of the ASEAN, I wish to deliver my national statement as follows. Madam President, over the past decades, despite efforts made to move on with disarmament and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, we have seen less or no progress. The humanitarian consequences resulting from any use of nuclear weapons would be huge to humankind, and therefore a forward-looking move towards multilateral negotiation for a world without nuclear weapons has become more important for us, as this has been reflected through the General Assembly Resolution 71/258, which was adopted last year. I would like to reaffirm Cambodia's principal position on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament and emphasize that the total elimination of nuclear weapons is the only guarantee against the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation in all its aspects is essential to strengthening international peace and security, which is an integral part of the International Charter. As we are going to listen to all member states' suggestions during these sessions and upcoming sessions in June this year, I wish to state that our ongoing negotiation must be conducted in transparently and open and in an all-inclusive and fair manner, taking into consideration the concerns of all member states. Accessibility to all negotiation processes should be also accorded to member states. Views from member states and groups should be fairly considered. While sharing ASEAN proposal towards the negotiation which centers on the provisions contained in those of the Treaty of Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone and the Non-Proliferation Treaty, I wish to make the following commitments. Of the three pillars, the NPT per se may be more successful in containing the proliferation and regulating peaceful use of nuclear energy, but has failed so far to achieve nuclear disarmament. Therefore, disarmament of nuclear weapons should be the center of our negotiation, which needs to be strengthened in the provisions of the draft instrument. The instrument should seek to complement and fill in the legal loophole of the NPT rather than undermining it. The fact that major regions have rejected nuclear weapons through promoting their nuclear weapon-free zone is an important momentum for us to strengthen the international law. The main concern is the entry into force, which would require time and political commitment for this to happen. One example is that the CTBT, which is still facing a high hurdle as it has yet to enter into force. I believe that the ultimate goal of the instrument is to make it become universalized so that it reaches to achieve our final objective of a world without nuclear weapons. Mr. President, constructive and flexible engagements as key elements for success through the entire negotiation processes. I'm certain that under your wise leadership and guidance, we would be able to formulate a new instrument that would contribute to the promotion of a strong global norm on nuclear weapons. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cambodia, and I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Argentina to the United Nations. Thank you, Madam President. At the outset of this statement, I wish to congratulate you most sincerely on your election. To act as the president of this conference, we are convinced that your commitment, leadership and experience will guide the work of this conference, and we guarantee you and the Bureau of the conference the support and cooperation of the Argentine delegation. The Argentine delegation endorses the statement which was made by the distinguished representative of El Salvador on behalf of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. For this reason, I will do no more than emphasize a number of points which are particularly relevant for my country. The global picture in the sphere of disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation presents us with several challenges which require that the international community works constructively together and requires that it achieves the broadest possible consensus in order to achieve the ultimate goal of a world free of nuclear weapons. Argentina has in place a dynamic, robust nuclear program for the use of nuclear energy for exclusively peaceful purposes within the framework of the strictest possible compliance with norms enshrined in international treaties. Consequently, my country views as a matter of utmost priority the issue of nuclear disarmament and has made a great deal of effort in this sphere as the reflection of a clear and long-term commitment to disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. Thus, as far as nuclear disarmament is concerned, while we do acknowledge that measures at a unilateral and bilateral level have come into being to move forward in the destruction of nuclear arsenals, we nevertheless hope to see decisive commitment taken on behalf of nuclear weapon states to expeditiously fulfill their obligations in the sphere of nuclear disarmament under Article 6 of the NPT. We note with regret that as things stand, the lack of a clear and unequivocal commitment to nuclear disarmament introduces a certain degree of uncertainty when it comes to maintaining the delicate balance between the NPT obligations. This worrying reality, however, should not stymie the diplomatic efforts to promote disarmament. Argentina laments that this negotiation conference is taking place in the absence of nuclear weapon states. This thus makes it a negotiation exercise to ensure that we disarm the disarmed. This was something said years ago by the permanent representative of Argentina to the General Assembly. We must go beyond simply reiterating in a sterile fashion the need for the prohibition of nuclear weapons among nuclear weapon states and move towards the elimination of existing arsenals. This will only be possible if we pool our efforts to create fora for dialogue and negotiation which is fruitful between the 5 nuclear weapon states party to the NPT and non-nuclear weapon states. The next review cycle of the NPT will be the appropriate forum within which to promote joint work and will constitute a unique opportunity to overcome divides within the international community. Only participation and commitment of all will make it possible to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, the only guarantee against the threat or use of these weapons. Allow me, Madam President, to elaborate on the relationship between the NPT and this negotiation exercise. For Argentina, the current regime of disarmament and non-proliferation consolidated through the NPT incidentally is the cornerstone of this regime. The resolution which gave a mandate to this conference acknowledges rightly that the regime of disarmament and non-proliferation requires our efforts not only to maintain it in place but also to ensure it is strengthened. It is for this reason that our approach to the negotiation of a new instrument will use as its point of reference that overarching goal. In this connection, it is important to underscore that we are not starting from zero when it comes to the work which will move us towards a world free of nuclear weapons through their prohibition and total elimination in line with the mandate of this conference. For my country, Article 6 of the NPT encompasses in itself this goal because it declares obligatory the goal of general and complete disarmament, and it also provides for the possibility of prohibiting these arms in the future. In this connection, we must not undermine the operative and obligatory status which Article 6 of the NPT has and has always had to guarantee this goal. Madam President, in specific terms, we believe that on the one hand, the future instrument must contain all elements provided for in the negotiating mandate. It must include not only provisions to achieve the goal of the prohibition of nuclear weapons, it must also include provisions which make it possible to move towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons in an effectively verifiable fashion. Moreover, the future instrument must reaffirm the importance of the regime of the NPT, particularly Article 6, without undermining achievements already attained in this field of non-proliferation, and it must avoid being an alternative to this treaty. For this reason, it will be necessary to consider including specific measures which clarify the relationship, the future relationship that is between both instruments. By way of example, we believe it crucial to ensure that the future conventions includes express recognition of the facts that status as a state party to the Prohibition Treaty cannot be used to justify possible or existing withdrawal from the NPT. Moreover, for Argentina, none of the future provisions of the Convention should be able to subsume, replace, or be considered equivalent to the provisions of the NPT. These are based on a system of verification which is proven and effective and which functions under the aegis of the IAEA. Argentina is participating in this negotiation process, convinced that this is an initiative which will give rise to a new international norm. As such, it must strengthen achievements already attained and not call them into question. It is appropriate to state that a future treaty must be accompanied by pragmatic and effective actions agreed upon by Member States, and for this reason the results of the NPT Review Conference provide a crucial framework within which to ensure the achievement of nuclear disarmament and the strengthening of the system in general terms. The future treaty must be capable of being designed in such a way as to ensure this balance and must act as a forum for dialogue and understanding. Madam President, know that you have the full support of Argentina in your work, and many thanks for your attention. I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina. That brings us to the end of our speakers list for today. We've heard the final speaker for this meeting today, and we will continue working down the speakers list tomorrow at 10 a.m. in this very room. I wish to take this opportunity before I close the meeting to say to you that I am delighted with the beginning of our work today. We have heard a number of points of view. We have heard a great deal of motivation, and that is going to act as a driving force as we move forward with the work ahead of us. I would call upon us to undertake this work with the same dynamism tomorrow. A great deal of work has gone into and must continue to go into ensuring the success of this conference. The flexibility, all delegations must be flexible and be ready and willing to begin with the substantive discussions tomorrow and the discussions that we will have in the coming days. Have a good rest, and I'll see you tomorrow. I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate of New Zealand. In terms of the participation of the Cook Islands in Niue, if so is the desire by this conference, a separate decision can be taken to allow them to participate. The delegation of Iran has requested the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. As it happened to the distinguished delegate of New Zealand, the same happened to our delegation that we requested for the floor before the adoption of the rules of procedure, or let's say before you gavelled. And now we have a procedural question. According to the rule of the business, if there is a request before adoption of a document, then a delegation requesting for the floor has the right to explain his position or to state his request or whatever he intends to say to the conference. We, as a delegate, requested before you gavel to have the floor. And this opportunity was not given to us. And now you are actually deciding that the rules of procedure of the conference was adopted while there was a request for the floor beforehand. And we want to have clarification from the legal section of the conference, and more importantly, the question is that this request for the floor was exactly directed at the issue at hand. I mean the adoption of the rules of procedure. Then I would be very appreciative to hear the comments of the legal advisor of the conference on that. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la
I thank the distinguished delegation of Iran. I have had it confirmed to me by the legal advisor of the conference that the rules of procedure have been adopted. Thus, we have concluded indeed our consideration of point 4 of the agenda, adoption of the rules of
procedure. I pushed the button and asked for the floor to ask if there is a possibility only to defer the issue for the next day, then we can consult with our capitals. Taking into account that now it is in the midnight in the capital and we cannot actually consult with our colleagues back in Tehran, and that's why I'm proposing the deferral of the consideration of this issue only to tomorrow. Then it will provide us with an opportunity to consult with our capital and hopefully come up with satisfactory, let's say at least some instruction that we can go along with these rules of procedure, or at least to have clear instruction contrary to what we have it now. This is my request, and if the President can defer this issue only 24 hours, and we can consider it later on, taking into account that we are not necessarily forced to do that now, and the decision on Palestine has been taken, and we can continue till tomorrow. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la
I thank the distinguished delegation of Iran for those comments. We have taken due note of those comments. The rules of procedure have been adopted by this conference. The conference wishes to move forward now with matters of substance. If you wish to make any amendments, you will have to use the rules proposed to do just that, but the rules of procedure as such have already been adopted. Thus, we now move forward with our consideration of procedural matters.
ha solicitado la
The delegation of New Zealand has asked for the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Here I am over here from New Zealand. Like my colleague from Iran, I did endeavour to signal to you that I had a question I wished to put before the rules of procedure were adopted. But unlike my colleague from Iran, I'm not wishing at all to defer adoption of those rules today. I just wanted clarification, please, Madam President, about the intention in deleting Rule 56, which appears in the version of the rules we've just been handed out today, in red. I was concerned that the effect of the deletion of Rule 56 would not enable my colleagues from the South Pacific, the Cook Islands and Niue, states neither of which are members of the UN, it would not enable them to observe proceedings as we would have wished. I don't wish to delay adoption, and I understand it already has happened, of the rules of procedure, but I would just request clarification about why Rule 56 needs to be amended outside of its application to the Holy See and Palestine. Thank you very much.
The second plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards the total elimination is called to order. Vamos a abordar en esta tarde.
This afternoon, we will begin with procedural aspects of the conference, beginning with item 4 on the agenda, that is the adoption of rules of procedure. We will begin, first of all, with looking at the issue of participation. I'm now going to move into English.
The conference will now consider the participation of the Holy See and the State of Palestine in this conference. Member states will recall that there has been a great deal of discussion concerning the participation of the Holy See and the State of Palestine in the conference on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote. After having listened to member states, it would appear that there is an overwhelming desire that the Holy See and the State of Palestine participate in the conference on an equal basis, including with the right to vote. However, I would like to reiterate that the General Assembly Resolution 71-58 only encouraged member states to participate in the conference. The resolution does not specifically refer to the Holy See and to the State of Palestine participating on an equal basis with member states, and therefore, both states would normally participate as observer states. After taking into account the very strong views of member states and the fact that there is no time to revert to the General Assembly on this matter, I would like to propose the following procedural decision of the conference. That without setting a precedent, the Holy See and the State of Palestine participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote in the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. If there are no comments on this proposal, may I take that the conference decide that without setting a precedent, the Holy See and the State of Palestine shall participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote in the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. I have the request from the floor for the delegation of Mexico.
Many thanks, Madam Chair. This morning, my Vice Minister had the honour of congratulating you and offering you every support, the full support of my delegation. This is something that I personally now wish to reiterate to you. I don't want to refer to the substance of this decision. I simply wish to understand the procedure followed and the implications which it has regarding the rules of procedure which will guide the work of this conference. What are the links between this decision and any other decision which may be necessary to adopt regarding the rules of procedure which will guide the procedure followed by this conference? I just wanted a little bit more detail and clarity from you or from the Office of Legal Affairs, if necessary, through you on these matters. Thank you. I thank the delegation of Mexico. This decision is necessary to be able to proceed with the adoption of the rules of procedure and the amendments which have been tabled with a view to reflecting this desire, a desire that's been expressed by the room, that is to have the State of Palestine and the Holy See participating in this conference on an equal footing. This procedural decision which I'm proposing is necessary so that we are able to begin to broach the issue of the rules of procedure and their corresponding modifications and amendments more specifically. If there are no further comments, can I take it that the conference decided that without there being established a president, the State of Palestine and the Holy See are to be able to participate on an equal footing with member states, including with a right to vote, in the United Nations Conference for the negotiation of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. There are no further comments. It is so decided. Before we move to looking at the rules of procedure, allow me to invite the Holy See and the State of Palestine to take their seats in the conference.
Entramos al conocimiento.
We now move to the consideration and adoption of the rules of procedure. I now speak English.
I wish to draw your attention, the attention of the delegates, to the proposed provisional rules of procedure of the conference contained in document A/conf.229/2017/L.1 and to the revisions being circulated desk to desk in the conference room now to reflect the decision just taken by the conference. On this matter, I have undertaken informal consultations on these draft procedural rules, both in Geneva and in New York, and it is my understanding that the conference is prepared to proceed to their adoption with the revisions as circulated. I will give the delegations just a few minutes to make sure that the document has reached you.
I'm now going to look at the reference to, I'm going to look at the changes proposed now.
I am going to refer to the revised version of the Rules of Procedure. In Rule 1, the following amendments have been introduced. The words member and of the United Nations are deleted. So the rule as a whole now reads: the delegation of each state participating in the conference shall consist of a head of delegation and such other representatives, alternate representatives, and advisors as may be required. A footnote is included after the word state, which explains the term state is understood as the member states of the United Nations and the Holy See, and the State of Palestine as the observer states of the United Nations in light of the procedural decision taken by the conference on March 2017 that the Holy See and the State of Palestine will participate on an equal basis with member states, including with the right to vote. End of the footnote. Subsequently, the term member states, where it appears throughout the rules, now reads states. The rules affected by this change include Rule 6, Rule 19, Rule 34, Rule 35, Rule 36, Rule 37, Rule 61, and Rule 63. Rule 56 is deleted, and the subsequent rules are renumbered accordingly. Those are the amendments that were introduced to the draft rules of procedure that we're now considering after the adoption of the procedural decision that we have recently taken. May I take it that the wish of the conference is to adopt the draft provisional rules of procedure as contained in document L.1 as orally revised? It is so decided. The Republic of Iran had requested for the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First, allow me to congratulate you, Madam President, for presiding over this important meeting, which is aimed at prohibiting nuclear weapons and the total elimination of these inhuman weapons. Indeed, presiding over this important conference is an honor. Secondly, allow me to be the first who congratulate the State of Palestine and the Holy See for having their position within the member states of the United Nations participating in this conference. The position that they deserve it. And I also congratulate you, Madam President, for the consultations you conducted on this issue and your ability to have the conference to adopt such an important decision today. And thirdly, Madam President, in regard to the rules of procedure, as it is well known for many delegations in the hall, we had some concerns, not about the whole rules of procedure, but only in regard to the issues related to the consensus. And despite some consultations that we had and also discussions we had with different delegations and with you, Madam President, unfortunately, we couldn't come to an agreement to go along with the decision. And that's why before you decide and adopt